quiet never reached me, not even after the parade stopped. I only hear the sand, and the promise I broke. Sometimes I think the ghosts are just my memory. The air in the Brooklyn apartment was thick with dust and the smell of stale pipe tobacco. At 28, Tom felt 100 years old. Back home, they called him a hero, but he just felt like a fraud wearing a clean uniform. The quiet never reached him, not even after the parade stopped. It was the summer of 46. The war was over, but his war wasn't. It lived in the tremor of his hand every time he tried to pour coffee, in the sudden gut-wrenching silence that replaced the constant thunder of artillery. He was Tom Atherton, once a photographer for the Daily News, now just a man who developed other people's memories. He worked in a small dark-room basement, the familiar chemical fumes the only comfort he had left. The darkness was safer than the blinding sunlight of the real world. He remembered D-Day, not the maps or the strategy, but the noise, the sheer physical weight of the noise that crushed you into the sand. He was a rifleman then, carrying a camera instead of a Garand, a grunt with a lens, not a bayonet. His job was to capture the truth of Omaha Beach, but the truth was too big to fit in any frame. He'd left a girl behind in 44, Eleanor, a smile that smelled like rain and old books. Their last night was a blur of sweat and desperate words on a park bench by the Hudson. He'd promised her a life free of shadows, a house where the sound of the ocean was the only thing that woke them. "I'll be back before the leaves turn," he'd whispered, the lie tasting like rust in his mouth. He hadn't been. Now, 2 years later, a crate of undeveloped film arrived from an army correspondent who hadn't made it out of the Rhineland. Tom had to process it for the official records. He hated it. He hated seeing the faces of the dead before their families did. He submerged the first roll in the developer tank. The emulsion slowly gave way, the images rising to the surface like drowned men. Tanks, smoke, a blurred German trench. And then there was one frame. A small blurry shot of a farmhouse window in rural France. A window slightly ajar, with a single small glove placed on the sill. A woman's glove. It was Eleanor's. He knew the stitching. He'd given it to her on a freezing Christmas Eve back in 41. The sound of the dripping water in the darkroom suddenly became louder than any mortar fire he'd ever heard. Tom's lungs seized. The air in the darkroom turned to glass in his chest. He ripped the film from the tank, his fingers stinging. He forgot the process, forgot everything but that tiny, perfect image of the glove materializing like a ghost in the shallow tray. The correspondent who took the picture, Sergeant Davies, had been killed outside Metz in 45, a name on a roster, a number. Davies' sparse notes mentioned a recon mission near a village called Sainte-Hélène, just another foxhole on a dirty map, a place to die. Eleanor was supposed to be in Massachusetts, working as a typist for the Navy. That was the story she'd sold him, the one he'd clutched to in the mud of the Ardennes. That was the last letter he'd received, the paper thin and soft from too many readings in too many rain-soaked tents. "I miss the silence of your eyes," she'd written. He'd held on to that line, a fragile piece of home, a reminder of a man he used to be. But this photograph proved the lie. It was a truth bomb, detonating in the quiet of his basement sanctuary. That glove, with its distinct, almost invisible darn near the thumb, a repair he'd watched her make by lamplight, meant she had been in France. In a war zone. In 1945, long after the letters had stopped coming, after he'd already assumed she'd moved on, found a whole man, or maybe she'd just gotten tired of waiting for a ghost who smelled of cordite and fear. His hands, which had learned a surgeon's steadiness in this very room, were trembling now. He fumbled for the manila file, the one he'd been dreading. Davies, M. Sergeant, KIA, Rhineland, 1945 flying. The paper felt greasy. He scanned the mission report, his eyes snagging on the clinical phrases. Reconnaître Sainte-Hélène. Objective: locate and assist a suspected Allied agent who had gone silent. The agent's code name was Sparrow. A sparrow. He almost laughed, a dry, hollow sound that died in his throat. He thought about the kind of girl Eleanor was. Not a fighter, not a spy. A girl who cried at the end of Casablanca and could spend a whole afternoon in a museum, arguing with him about the correct way to pronounce Vermeer. A girl whose laughter was the only sound that could ever truly drown out the hum of approaching planes. But he also remembered her steel. The quiet, unyielding core he'd seen the day her father died. The kind you don't see until a fire is lit beneath it. The kind that doesn't bend. It sharpens. He slid down the cold concrete wall, the chemical smell of familiar acid in his nostrils. Sparrow, a small quiet bird, just like Eleanor. Her voice came back to him then, not from a letter but from memory, a whisper in the dark of a movie theater. If I can't fight with a gun, I'll fight with silence, Tom. Silence is also a weapon. He'd thought it was poetry then. A pretty thought from a girl who didn't know the sound a mortar makes when it finds its mark. Now he understood. It was a confession, a warning. He held the dripping film strip up to the red safety light. The world reduced to this blood-hued rectangle. The glove was undeniable, a deliberate signal left in a frame of chaos. It was a message meant for him, and him alone. She hadn't moved on. She had gone to war. He had to know what she was doing there. He had to know what they had made her do. He had to know if she was still there, in the rubble, or if all he would find was another unmarked grave in a field of too many. The war, he realized with a cold clarity that went down to his bones and settled there, was not over. It had simply been waiting for him, patient as a landmine. It was asking him one last time to come back. He spent the next 3 weeks in the army archives, a ghost, haunting the halls of a victory he no longer felt part of. He used his old press pass and his hero status like a brass key, but it felt like a stolen credential in his hands. The men behind the desks, their uniforms crisp, saw a fellow soldier. He saw a man digging up a grave he was supposed to have left behind. He tracked down every surviving member of Davy's unit. Men scattered across the country, their voices crackling over bad phone lines or arriving in terse, handwritten letters. They were just grunts, they said. They didn't know the big picture, but from their fractured memories a shape began to form. He learned the vocabulary of shadows, words that felt alien on his tongue. Safe house. Drop zone. Cipher. This was a different war, fought in whispers and glances, and Eleanor had been fluent. Saint Helene, he learned, was a small knot of cobblestone and ruin in the Lorraine region, dangerously close to the German border. The maps showed a dot. The after-action reports described a meat grinder. Hard fighting had chewed it up in late 44, a forgotten battle in a war of giants. When Davy's team went in, it was a ghost hunt, looking for an American woman, a needle in a haystack of betrayal who had infiltrated a network of collaborationists. The official report on Agent Sparrow was a single, curt line, typed by someone who had already filed it away and moved on to the next tragedy. Status unknown. Presumed compromised. Presumed compromised. The words echoed in the silent, dusty room. In the language of war, it was a polite way of saying vanished. Liquidated. Left in a ditch. He pulled one of Eleanor's old letters from his pocket, the paper soft as skin from being handled too much. He traced a faint smudged lipstick stain on the back with his thumb. He'd always thought it was a typist's mark, a little piece of the girl she'd been. Now he saw it for what it was. A soldier's mask, a deliberate flaw. She had become someone else while he was busy dodging bullets in the hedgerows of Normandy, counting the days until he could go back to her. She had become someone braver, and he had been too blind to see it. The guilt was a physical weight now, a full rucksack of stones strapped to his back, heavier than any pack he'd carried across Europe. He hadn't protected her. He'd written letters about the weather. He'd promised a future of quiet mornings, while she was learning to lie, to steal, to kill. Worse, he hadn't even known she needed protecting. The thought was a shard of glass in his gut. He was about to leave, the lead gone cold when he found it. Buried under a pile of useless field reports in a discarded cardboard box marked Davies M. Effects was a manila envelope. Inside, tucked between a faded map and a receipt for cigarettes, was one more photograph. It wasn't a spy shot. It was a portrait. A quick, dirty but undeniably clear shot of Eleanor. She was wearing a borrowed peasant dress, too big for her frame, the fabric hanging off her shoulders. A rifle sling was slung across her chest, the wood of the stock worn smooth. She was standing in the dappled sunlight of a ruined courtyard, broken stones and a single stubborn rose bush at her feet. Her face was gaunt, the softness he remembered carved away by hunger and fear. Her eyes were too old, holding a landscape of sorrow he couldn't navigate. But the smile, It was still there, crooked, defiant, a small private rebellion against the ruin surrounding her. She wasn't the girl he'd left on a park bench by the Hudson, her smile smelling of rain and old books. That girl was gone. This was the woman the war had made, forged in a fire he'd only ever skirted the edges of. And in her eyes there was a message, silent and cold, aimed directly at him. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a challenge, a verdict. You thought you knew war. You thought you knew me. You don't know anything. He stared at the photograph until the image burned itself onto the back of his eyelids, a permanent negative. The woman in the ruined courtyard was now the only Eleanor that existed. And he knew, with a certainty that left no room for breath, that he would have to cross an ocean to find her, or spend the rest of his life drowning in the quiet of his own failure. He booked passage on the first troop transport heading back to Europe. He used his remaining savings, his medal, and a lot of practiced silence to get him onto the rusted hull of the SS Victory. No uniform this time, just a worn trench coat and the photograph of Eleanor, the one from the courtyard. The one with the rifle and the defiant ghost of a smile, tucked into the breast pocket right over his heart. The sea was grey and unforgiving, a vast empty grave. He spent his nights on the deck, smoking Lucky Strikes and watching the stars that looked so cold, so indifferent to human suffering. They were the same stars that had watched over the beach at Normandy, over the frozen forests of the Ardennes. They offered no comfort. Below deck, the smell of the mess hall, a familiar stew of boiled meat and collective anxiety, clung to everything. He remembered the feel of his dog tags against his skin, a cold reminder that he was just government-issued property, a number with a heartbeat. Now he felt even less than that, a ghost returning to haunt his own past. He arrived in Le Havre, a ghost town of debris and salvaged hope. The cranes were working, lifting skeletons of ships from the water, but the air still tasted of rust and old salt. Paris, they said, was dancing. But the countryside, the road east towards Lorraine, still bled. He saw it in the eyes of the people, in the way they watched the horizon, still waiting for the sound of engines that didn't belong. He hitched a ride on a battered truck carrying medical supplies, the driver a silent Frenchman with a scar where his left ear should have been. The closer they got to Sainte-Hélène, the more the memories intensified, rising from the soil like a poison gas. The smell of burning wood, not from hearths but from homes. The high-pitched, gut-twisting whistle of mortars that existed only in his head. He felt the old, familiar knot of fear tightening in his stomach, a fist clenching around his insides. He was hunting a memory, a ghost in a photograph. But he knew, with a soldier's cold instinct, that he was also hunting his own redemption, or his damnation. He was no longer a soldier, no longer a journalist with a press pass and a clean conscience. He was just a man with a photograph, chasing the echo of a broken promise through a landscape that had swallowed promises whole. Sainte-Hélène was worse than the photographs could ever convey. It wasn't just ruined. It was eviscerated. The church spire was gone, replaced by a jagged, accusing hole in the sky. The silence here was different from the silence of his dark room. This was a heavier, deeper quiet, the kind that had absorbed the screams and now just held them, a saturated sponge of sorrow. It was the kind of quiet where you could hear the past breathing down your neck. He walked the ruins, his footsteps too loud on the broken cobblestones. He found the house from the photo. The farmhouse wall was pockmarked with bullet holes. The window from the photograph was still there, still slightly ajar. The glove was gone. He pressed his palm against the cold, damp stone of the wall where Eleanor had stood. He tried to feel some residue of her presence. There was only the profound cold of absence. And then a sound. Not a blast from the past, not a mortar's roar. A whisper, a soft grating complaint of wood on stone. A door, creaking open in the cellar below him. His breath hitched. His hand, of its own accord, slipped into his coat pocket, his fingers closing around the cold, familiar weight of the small pistol he'd smuggled past the customs men. An old habit, a useless gesture against the ghost he was chasing. He looked down at the cellar entrance, a dark, gaping maw half hidden by a collapsed beam and a tangle of dead ivy. The sound came again, an invitation, or a warning. He was no longer Tom Atherton, the hero from Brooklyn. He was just a man standing at the mouth of the underworld, his heart a frantic drum against the photograph in his pocket, ready to descend into whatever truth, whatever hell awaited him below. The cellar smelled of damp earth and old cider, a scent that clung to the back of his throat like a memory of a different kind of rot. The stone steps under his boots were crumbling, slick with a black mildew that felt like the skin of a long-drowned thing. And with each step down, the cold, heavy silence of the place began to bleed from the walls, swallowing the last echoes of the world above. The whispering stopped the moment his soul touched the packed earth floor. The space was small, a tomb carved from stone and shadow, lit by the weak orange halo of a single kerosene lamp. The air was still. It held its breath. In the corner, sitting on an overturned ammunition crate, was an old French woman. Her face was a road map of sorrow, each wrinkle a trench line, each furrow a story of loss. Her hands, gnarled and strong, were methodically cleaning a rifle, the cloth moving with a steady, practiced rhythm that spoke of a long and terrible familiarity with violence. She looked him up and down, the American trench coat, the eyes that had seen too much, the posture of a man permanently braced for impact, and she didn't look impressed. She looked resigned. "You are late," she said. Her English was perfect, but her voice was raspy, scraped raw by smoke and silence. Tom felt his blood run cold, a sensation that had nothing to do with the cellar's chill. Late for what? For the sparrow. She placed the rifle down with a soft final click. She pointed a bony finger to a small wooden box sitting directly under the lamp as if on an altar. She said if an American came looking, one who did not wear a uniform and who carried too much sorrow in his pockets, I was to give him this. Tom's heart was a frantic bird against his ribs. He approached the box, his movements slow, deliberate, like a man approaching a live shell. It was a simple lockbox, no bigger than his two hands. And there, carved roughly into the lid with what might have been a knife tip, were the words that shattered him. His broken promise from the park bench. His promise, the one he'd whispered on a park bench a lifetime ago, the lie that had tasted like rust, the one he'd broken. His fingers, clumsy and numb, fumbled with the simple brass latch. The click echoed in the small space. Inside there was no map to hidden treasure, no spy documents wrapped in oilskin. Just two objects, resting on the bare wood like relics in a shrine. A single tarnished dog tag, and a thick, tightly rolled sheaf of papers bound with a thin, faded green ribbon, the color of Eleanor's eyes in the sun. He picked up the dog tag first. The metal was cold, impersonal. It read, Davies, Monsieur Sergeant, Catholic. It wasn't Davies' official issue tag. This one was smoother, the edges worn soft, a private piece, a gift. A trade between two people in the shadows. A piece of something intimate handed over in the dark. He set it down, the weight of it immense in his palm. Then he took the sheaf of papers. The ribbon came loose with a gentle tug. He unrolled the pages carefully, the paper crackling like dry bones. The writing was Eleanor's, that elegant, looping script he'd traced with his fingers on letters that smelled of home. But it was shakier now. The lines less sure, as if written by a hand that had learned to hold far heavier things than a pen. It wasn't a diary. It was a confession, and the first line, written in that familiar, altered hand, hit him like a physical blow, a truth he was never meant to hear, a shell burst of memory right in the center of his chest. "My dearest ghost," Konami began. The word seemed to vibrate in the silent, damp air. Ghost, that's what he was. That's what he'd become to her. He had to lean against the cold stone wall, the paper trembling in his hand, the kerosene lamp flickering as if in sympathy. The old woman watched him, her expression unchanging, a monument to patience and grief. She had seen this before. She had seen men come undone by the contents of that box. She had seen the war take them in ways bullets never could. He read the next line, and the world he thought he knew, the war he thought he had survived, cracked open beneath his feet, revealing a deeper, darker battlefield where the woman he loved had fought a war he never knew existed. "My dearest ghost, if you are reading this, then the silence has finally broken. I pray it is you, Tom, and not just another man looking for a hero's end. I had to tell you this way because the truth of the resistance is that it is not a story you can ever walk away from." The words were a gut punch, knocking the air from his lungs. He could hear her voice in them, the old one, the one from the park bench, now layered with a gravelly weariness. The red darkroom light had never felt so much like hellfire. Eleanor wrote that after he left, the silence of waiting had become a physical presence, a fourth wall in her small room that pressed in on her until she couldn't breathe. The headlines were a daily torment. She felt useless. She knew French from her college years, a party trick back then. A contact had reached out, a quiet man in a grey suit who smelled of mint and mothballs. He didn't ask if she was brave. He asked if she was tired of being afraid. She became Sparrow, a courier first, carrying coded messages in the hollowed-out heels of her shoes. Then a translator, her ear bent to the casual cruelties of German officers in cafes. Then finally a spy. Her mission in Sainte-Hélène was to verify a list of targets for the Allied bombing campaign. A wrong coordinate could mean a school, a hospital. She had infiltrated the German commander's house by posing as a distant, simple-minded cousin of the French owners. She was a ghost in the wallpaper, learning the rhythm of their boots on the floorboards, the timbre of their laughter. She learned to make herself small, to fold her soul into the cracks in the plaster. Davies' recon team had come through in the middle of this. Davies, the photographer with the kind eyes, wasn't just taking pictures for the history books. He was her pre-arranged extraction. His signal was the glove on the sill. A woman's glove out of place, a beacon. He'd carried the special unofficial dog tag as identification, a piece of him to trade for her safe passage out. A token of trust in a world that had outlawed it. He was waiting for her at the window of the farmhouse on the night the picture was taken. The moon was a sliver, but the meeting went wrong. A collaborator, a man from the village with a face like a friendly butcher, had gotten suspicious. He'd followed her. She wrote about the weight of killing a man for the first time. It wasn't in a field, not like in the movies. It was in the cramped pantry of the farmhouse, the smell of dried sausages and earth thick in the air. He wasn't a soldier, but a butcher who had betrayed his own people for extra rations and a sense of power. He grabbed her. There was a struggle. A paring knife meant for cheese found his throat. "The blood on my hands smelled exactly like the sea salt back home, Tom," she wrote. The ink blotting as if the paper itself was bleeding. That metallic living smell, and I knew I was lost. The girl who cried at sad movies was gone. I had crossed a line and there was no coming back. The sound had drawn attention. Davies was captured moments after signaling her, the crunch of German boots on the gravel path a death sentence. The Germans were closing in, a net tightening around the entire village network. Eleanor, from her hiding spot in the root cellar, her hands still slick, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs, made a final, terrible choice. She could try to save Davies and risk the entire intelligence operation, the lives of every agent in the region, and the success of the bombing campaign. Or she could save the mission. She had to save the mission, not the man. She took the real list, a tiny roll of film no bigger than her thumbnail, and swallowed it. Then she planted the false one, a clever, damning piece of fiction, on the collaborator's body, along with a note she forged in Davies's hand, implicating him as a lone rogue agent. She offered up Davies to save the many. She used his capture, his certain death, as her shield. It was the most brutal calculus of war, a decision made in the space between two heartbeats, in the absolute darkness, with the taste of iron and salt in her mouth. She sacrificed a good man to the wolves so that the flock could live. Eleanor's words were slow, methodical, stripped bare of any emotion save a raw, crushing honesty. They weren't written for posterity, but for a single pair of eyes. A confession for one. She described the mechanics of her betrayal with the cold precision of a field surgeon. She had planted the false information, a list of dummy targets for the bombers, and ensured the Germans would find it. She forged a note in Davies' hand, a desperate, rambling confession from a lone rogue agent who had acted without the network's knowledge. She used his capture as her shield. It bought her, and the true list of targets she had swallowed, just enough time to slip into the frozen woods. "I betrayed him to save the many, Tom. I sent a good man to die for my silence. I can't ever unring that bell. That's the true cost of being Sparrow." Her escape was a litany of suffering. A brutal week through the frozen Ardennes, the snow stained with the memory of the bulge. She slept in foxholes dug by dead men, her body a map of frostbite and exhaustion. The sound of distant artillery was her only lullaby. When she finally stumbled into the liberated zone, her clothes in tatters, her eyes hollowed out, she didn't look like a hero. She looked like what she was, a ghost. She handed over the tiny roll of film, the intel that would pave the way for the final, brutal offensives into Germany. And then she asked for one thing, to be erased. She never went back to the States. She couldn't. The girl from Massachusetts had died in that root cellar, her hands stained with a different kind of war paint. She told the Allied command that Agent Sparrow was KIA, a convenient lie. They needed deniable assets for the new shadow war dawning over the ruins. She became a permanent ghost, a knife for the newly formed intelligence services in Berlin, hunting the ghosts of the Third Reich. They needed a face no one knew, a past that was officially dead. That's me now. I'm not the Eleanor who loved you. I'm a knife. He closed his eyes, the confession crinkling in his trembling hand. The air in the cellar was thick with the smell of damp earth and old secrets. The real hero wasn't him with his clean medal in a Brooklyn apartment. It was the broken woman who had sacrificed her very soul for a victory he had the luxury to take for granted. He had fought a war of noise and fire. She was fighting a war of silence and shadows. Which one was heavier? He saw the photograph of the glove again in his mind, not a clue, but a beacon. Left for him, specifically. A sign that she was alive, but a test, too. She was giving him a chance to walk away, to live the simple life they had planned on that park bench, blissfully unaware of the monstrous price she had paid to help secure that future. She was offering him an escape from the truth. But the dog tag, Davy's tag, cool and heavy in his other hand, that was the real hook she had set in his heart. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a key. It unlocked the part of the story her words couldn't convey. The weight of it spoke of a private understanding, a transaction between two soldiers in a war that had no rules. He pictured Davies in his final moments, not the heroic death of a war correspondent, but the messy, brutal end of a spy. Had he known what she had done? Had he seen the German net closing and understood, in that last clear second, that her sacrifice of him was the only move left on the board? The tag felt like an answer. It felt like forgiveness. Madame Dubois watched him from her crate, her knitting needles clicking a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the pounding of his heart. She had seen this before, the moment a man's war is rewritten for him. The moment he realizes the front lines were not just beaches and forests, but the hidden contours of a human soul pushed to its absolute limit. Tom looked from the dog tag to the confession. One was a soldier's identity discarded. The other was a woman's identity, annihilated and rebuilt into a weapon. He had come to France looking for the woman he loved. He had found her last will and testament. The Eleanor he knew was gone. But this new Eleanor, this knife, she had left him a piece of evidence, not to draw him in, but to make him understand why he had to let go. He had promised to come back to her. She had promised him a life. Both promises lay shattered on the cellar floor between them, another casualty of a war that refused to end. The hook was in. He could either tear it out and walk away bleeding, or he could follow the line into the deep, dark water where she now lived. There was no choice, not really. He was already swimming toward her. The Frenchwoman, who introduced herself only as Madame Dubois, watched him with patient, tired eyes. She was part of the old guard, the silent ones who cleaned up the mess after the armies left. Her face was a testament to 100 small private wars fought in cellars, just like this one. "Davies," Tom whispered, the cold metal of the dog tag biting into his palm. Was he the one who... He was very young, Madame Dubois said simply, her voice the sound of gravel and grief. And very brave. He knew what she did. He understood the necessity. When they took him, he was calm. She took a long, slow drag from a hand-rolled cigarette, the ember flaring in the dim kerosene light, a tiny dying star. Eleanor found him later, after the Germans retreated. They had left him in a ditch by the road. She traded something very valuable for his tag. A piece of the truth, she said, was all the payment a good man deserved. She didn't elaborate on what that truth was. Some prices were too high to speak aloud. Davy's body was buried nearby in an unmarked plot under a bare oak tree. Eleanor hadn't wanted him in a national cemetery with marble and flags. She wanted him close to the ground he died defending, the soil his blood had watered. A soldier's rest for a man who had died is something more. Tom spent the night in the ruined farmhouse, the confession laid out on the warped wooden floorboards like a map of a forgotten battle. The wind whistled through the shattered window frame, a ghost playing a hollow tune. He read her words by the light of a single candle, the flame guttering and dancing as if trying to escape the weight of the story. "I can't come back, Tom. I'm too loud here now. The silence of America would crush me. But you were the only quiet I ever knew. Go home, don't look for me. Let the ghost live because the woman is a monster. Love, Eleanor." The words were a shield and a dagger, thrown from across an ocean and 2 years of hell. She was protecting him from her new reality, a world of moral calculus where sacrificing one good man was the cost of saving 1,000. He traced the word monster with a trembling finger. It wasn't a confession of evil. It was a statement of fact from a woman who had looked into the abyss and found it staring back from her own reflection. He had promised to build a house where the ocean was the only sound. A simple dream for a simple man. She had built a fortress where silence was the only defense, her every breath a classified document, her every memory a locked file. He thought of the glove on the windowsill. It wasn't just a sign, it was a flare, a desperate final attempt to see if the man she loved could still find a trace of her in the ashes. And he'd followed it all the way into this cellar of truths. He folded the letter, the paper crisp from age and tension. The hook was in, just as he'd thought. But it wasn't pulling him toward her. It was anchoring him to this moment of terrible understanding. To follow the line into her dark water would be to dishonor her sacrifice, to make her impossible choice meaningless. She had given him the one thing she could no longer possess, a chance at the quiet life. He stood as the first grey light of dawn bled through the ruins. He could smell the damp earth, the old stone, the lingering scent of Madame Dubois' tobacco. It was the smell of Europe, the smell of her war. He left a handful of francs on the crate, a useless gesture for a debt that could never be paid, and climbed the steps back into the world. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise. He looked once more at the farmhouse window, the place where a glove had once rested and a promise had been silently broken. Then he turned and began the long walk back to the road, the confession a new, heavier set of dog tags against his heart. He was not leaving her. He was finally learning how to love the ghost she had become. He left Sainte-Hélène at dawn, leaving the lockbox and the dog tag with Madame Dubois. He should stay here, Tom told her, his voice rough with a lack of sleep and too much truth. He belongs to this soil now. She had merely nodded, a slow, grave dip of her chin that was more meaningful than any salute he'd ever received. He took the confession papers, folding them carefully into the inner pocket of his coat. They were a new, heavier set of dog tags for his heart. Their weight, a constant reminder of the chasm between the boy who had gone to war and the man stumbling out of its aftermath. He worked his way south, a ghost riding in the backs of trucks carrying rebuilding supplies, heading towards the Italian border. It was a logical place for a ghost to hide. He navigated by the stars of her old self, the constellations of her habits. She loved opera, the grand, tragic sweep of it. She drank her coffee black, a preference she'd called honest. And she had a weakness for places where the architecture looked older than human sorrow, where beauty had already witnessed centuries of ruin and stood anyway. In a dusty administrative office in Milan, flashing his old press credentials and a look of weary authority, he found a thread. A brief classified internal memo about a new linguistics expert attached to the CIOS. The expert's name was E. Vance. Vance was Eleanor's mother's maiden name. It was her, a whisper in the bureaucratic machine, a footprint in the ash. He didn't contact the office. To do so would be to trigger alarms in whatever shadow world she now inhabited. Instead, he went to the opera house. It was a long shot, a romantic, ridiculous idea born of exhaustion and a desperate, clawing need to see her face, to confirm that the woman in the confession was not just ink and memory. The Teatro della Pergola was a jewel box of gilt and velvet, but the war's scars were still visible if you knew where to look. A patched-up section of the ceiling fresco, a faint smell of damp plaster underneath the perfume. He bought a ticket for the cheap seats in the balcony, high up where the air was thick with dust and distant music. The house was half empty, the audience a collection of hushed, well-dressed ghosts. The orchestra began. Puccini, Madama Butterfly. The woman's voice, a soprano of lament and impossible beauty, filled the hall, soaring into the dome. Tom closed his eyes, letting the music wash over the permanent ringing in his ears. The high-frequency whine that had been his constant companion since the first mortar fell near St. Lo. For a few precious bars, the music was louder than the war inside his head. When he opened them, his gaze, practiced from 100 reconnaissance missions, swept the lower boxes. And there she was. She was sitting alone, cloaked in a heavy dark velvet coat that seemed to absorb the light. Her hair, once worn loose around her shoulders, was pulled back into a severe knot that sharpened the lines of her face. She was thinner, the softness he remembered carved away, leaving behind an elegant, terrifying sharpness. She watched the stage, but her eyes held a deeper, more distant sadness, a look he recognized from medics staring at a field of triage. She wasn't just watching a tragedy. She was remembering one. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He just watched, committing this new version of her to memory, a photograph he couldn't take. A negative that would be seared onto the back of his eyelids forever. This was the woman the war had made. The girl from the park bench by the Hudson was a phantom, a pleasant dream he'd had once. This woman in the velvet coat was the reality, honed by fire and sacrifice into a blade. And God help him, he thought she was the most devastating thing he had ever seen. At the intermission, the house lights rose, a slow, cruel illumination. She stood, smoothing her coat with a gesture that was all business, and for one devastating second, her eyes lifted and scanned the balcony. They found his. His breath stopped in his lungs, a solid, painful thing. He didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He just held her gaze across the dark, silent expanse of the theater, a chasm of ruined years and broken promises between them. Her eyes registered no shock, no startled jump, just a flicker of surprise, then a devastating, controlled acceptance. No joy, no tears, just the cold, profound understanding of two soldiers recognizing each other in a no-man's land. She knew he had read the letter. She knew he had followed the trail of the glove, through the cellar and the confession, all the way to this opera house. She knew he understood the cost. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate dip of his head. It was a gesture that held a lifetime of words. "I forgive you. I understand. I am here." She did not nod back. Her expression remained a perfect, unreadable cipher. She simply pulled the velvet coat tighter around her, a shield against a chill only she could feel. And without breaking that soul-piercing eye contact, she raised one hand. Her fingers, clad in simple black gloves, touched the empty space on her left ring finger where her engagement ring used to sit. It was a gesture of finality as clear as a slammed door. This is not the life you planned. This is not the woman you loved. Then she turned. She did not look back. She walked out of the box, a shadow merging with the other shadows in the corridor, and was gone. He didn't follow. He couldn't. To chase her would be to unravel the last thread of her cover, to betray the sacrifice of Sergeant Davies and the fortress of silence she had built around herself. He was a ghost, and she was a shadow, and their worlds could only ever intersect in these fleeting, silent collisions. He sat there in the cheap seat as the orchestra began the second act, the music now sounding like a funeral dirge for a future that had died somewhere in the ruins of a French farmhouse. He had found her, and in finding her, he had finally, truly lost her. She was sitting alone in a lower box, wrapped in a heavy, dark velvet coat that seemed to absorb the faint light of the house. Her eyes, however, were not on the stage. They were fixed on a particular horizon far beyond the painted scenery and the soaring voices, carrying a deeper, more distant sadness. She looked thinner, her cheekbones sharpened by a hunger that had nothing to do with food. The soft curves of the girl from the park bench were gone, planed away by a relentless war. This woman was honed by fire, her beauty now a weapon she kept sheathed in stillness. He didn't call her name. The word, Eleanor, was a fossil in his throat, a relic from a different epoch. He just watched, committing her to memory, a photograph he couldn't take, developing the image in the darkroom of his mind. He traced the line of her jaw, the set of her shoulders, the way her gloved hands rested in her lap. Not folded, but ready. This was his mission now, this silent surveillance, to capture this final, living proof of her. The music swelled, a Puccini aria of tragic love that felt like a mockery of their own story. The sound of the violins was the high, thin whine of a falling shell, and the singer's powerful voice was the thunder of the big guns on the Rhine. He was back in the foxhole, waiting for the impact. He was always waiting for the impact. At the intermission, the house lights came up, a slow, cruel dawn. She rose, a single, fluid motion of purpose. And for one devastating second, as she scanned the room out of ingrained habit, her gaze found his. It was not a search, but a sweep, and it landed on him like a sniper's round. His breath stopped. The air in the opera house turned to the thick, coppery taste of a battlefield. He didn't flinch. He just held her gaze across the dark, silent expanse of the theater, across the miles of ruined countryside and broken promises that lay between them. Her eyes registered a flicker of surprise, a brief fracture in her composure, and then a devastating, controlled acceptance. It was the look of a commander seeing the inevitable unfold on a map. No joy, no tears, just recognition and an immediate, profound understanding. She knew he had read the confession. She knew he had followed the trail of the glove, through the damp cellar and the ghost of Sergeant Davies, all the way to this opera house in a city trying to forget. She knew he understood the cost, the blood price she had paid to become Sparrow. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate dip of his head. It was a gesture that held a lifetime of words compressed into a single movement. I forgive you. I understand. I am here. She did not nod back. Her expression remained a perfect, unreadable cipher, the face she would have used to lie to a Gestapo officer. She simply pulled the velvet coat tighter around her, a shield against a chill only she could feel, and without breaking that soul-piercing eye contact, she raised one hand. Her fingers, clad in simple black gloves, touched the empty space on her left ring finger where her engagement ring used to sit. It was a gesture of finality as clear as a slammed door. This is not the life you planned. This is not the woman you loved. The girl who wore that ring died in Sainte-Hélène. Then she turned. She did not look back. She walked out of the box, a shadow merging with the other shadows in the corridor, and was gone. He didn't follow. He couldn't. To chase her would be to unravel the last thread of her cover, to betray the sacrifice of the man in the unmarked grave and the fortress of silence she had built around herself. He was a ghost from her past life, and she was a shadow in her new one. Their worlds could only ever intersect in these fleeting, silent collisions, a celestial event that left him blinded. He sat there, anchored to his cheap seat as the orchestra began the second act. The music now sounded like a funeral dirge for a future that had died somewhere in the ruins of a French farmhouse. The singer's lament was Eleanor's voice from her confession. I am a knife. The crashing cymbals were the sound of the cellar door closing for the last time. He had found her. He had looked into the eyes of the woman he loved more than peace, more than home, more than his own next breath. And in finding her, in seeing the magnificent, terrifying monument the war had built from the girl he once knew, he had finally, truly, lost her. The final note hung in the air, then faded into the silence he would carry with him for the rest of his days. It was over. The mission was a success. He had his confirmation. He stood up, his body feeling 100 years old, and walked out into the Florentine night, leaving the ghost of Eleanor Vance behind, already becoming a story he would never tell. He stayed in Florence for 2 more weeks, a ghost haunting the city's beautiful, broken heart. He walked the cobblestone streets until his boots were thin, past the Uffizi and over the Ponte Vecchio, his eyes scanning the crowds not for her, but for the absence she left in the air. He waited for a sign, a letter slipped under his hotel room door, a message passed by a silent waiter. Nothing came. The silence was her answer. He knew the terms of her surrender now. Her love for him was the very reason she had to stay away. To pull him into her new world would be to destroy them both. She had a new war, a colder one, fought in grey offices and quiet corridors. A new uniform of tailored suits and a new identity, E. Vance, forged in the blood of a French collaborator and the sacrifice of a good man named Davies. On the morning of the 15th day, the air crisp with the threat of autumn, he shaved, put on his last clean shirt, and went to the local CIOS office. It was a nondescript building tucked away on a side street, its windows still sandbagged from a war everyone pretended was over. He didn't ask for E. Vance. He didn't need to see the flicker of recognition in a clerk's eye, the subtle shift in posture that would confirm her presence. He was done with confirmations. He walked into the public reception area, a room that smelled of waxed linoleum and stale bureaucracy, spoke to a young Italian clerk about nothing of consequence, and as he turned to leave, he dropped a small, neatly folded piece of paper into the slotted wooden box on the wall labeled Linguistics Expert. The note was short. It contained only the last devastating line of her confession, but with a slight, almost imperceptible change. A single word correction that was his entire surrender. "I'm too loud here now. The silence of America would crush me. But you were the only quiet I ever knew. Go home, don't look for me. Let the ghost live because the woman is a monster. Love, Thomas." He signed it. Thomas, not Tom. Tom was the boy who had promised to return before the leaves turned. Tom was the grunt with a camera on Omaha Beach. Thomas was the man she had made him, the one who carried the weight of her truth, who understood the cost of her silence. It was the name of the man he was forced to become. That afternoon he boarded a train to Rome. He found a compartment alone, the leather seats cracked and smelling of old cigarettes and dust. He stowed his single bag and sat by the window, watching the Florentine rooftops recede, the Duomo's great dome finally swallowed by the hills. The train gave a lurch and began to move, steel wheels finding their rhythm on the tracks. Clack, 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 clack. It was the sound of distance growing, of a door closing. He was carrying the silence of 100 miles between them, a silence that would soon become an ocean. She had asked him to live the life they planned. He would try. He would go back to America, to the dark room, to the empty apartment in Brooklyn. He would try to build that house by the ocean, but he would live it alone, a keeper of her secret, a guardian of her sacrifice. He was her last living link to the innocent girl who had cried at sad movies, the girl she had to kill in that French farmhouse to become Sparrow, to become the knife. He was the sole curator of her memory, and that was a duty heavier than any medal. He knew she would find the note. She would unfold it in some secure room, under the glare of a single bulb, her hands steady. She would read the line, her own words thrown back at her, and her eyes would catch on the signature, Thomas. She would understand the forgiveness in that single, deliberate syllable. She would feel the finality of it. They had communicated more in that one silent look across the opera house, a conversation of grief, recognition, and an impossible, enduring love than they had in 2 years of censored letters filled with lies about the weather and how much they missed each other. And as the train picked up speed, leaving the ancient haunted city behind for good, he felt the truth settle in his bones, cold and absolute as a dog tag against his skin. This wasn't an ending. It was an armistice, a fragile, painful peace negotiated across a theater balcony. He had not lost her in that opera house. He had found the final terrible shape of her, and in doing so, he had finally understood his own role in her war. He was not the hero coming to the rescue. He was the anchor, the fixed point in the world she was protecting, the quiet she fought to preserve. His going home, his living of that ordinary life was his own deployment. His silence was his weapon, and as the Italian countryside blurred into a smear of green and gold outside his window, he accepted his orders. He would stand his post. He would keep the quiet, for her. He returned to New York, but the city was a ghost to him now. The dark room was his foxhole, the chemical fumes a familiar poison that smelled more like home than bread baking. He sold the Brooklyn apartment, the one that held the ghost of a park bench promise, and used the money to buy a small, weathered cabin on the coast of Maine. It was far from the parades, far from the lies they called peace. The quiet there wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of the past. The ocean was a constant gray reminder. He lived the life of a silent man. He developed photographs for the local weekly. sunrises over the lobster boats, the changing light on the pines, children at a county fair. Simple, clean images, nothing that bled. He never married. The women in town thought him a gentle, distant man, marked by the war in a way they were too polite to name. They didn't know he was already married to a ghost, his heart a classified document stamped, eyes only. He thought of her every day. It was a ritual like breathing. The wind whistling over the chimney brought back the high-pitched scream of an 88mm shell. The ocean rushing onto the shale beach recalled the crushing, ice-cold weight of the waves on Omaha Beach. His mind was an archive of sensory memories from the war. The guilt over Davies was a permanent resident in the cabin's spare room. He was the survivor, the one who came home to a hero's welcome, while a braver man, a man who had traded his life for Eleanor's mission, lay in an unmarked grave in French soil. He'd carried a rifle. Davies had carried a camera and a special dog tag for a sparrow. Who was the real soldier? But that guilt was now tempered, annealed by a profound, aching respect for Eleanor's impossible choice. She hadn't just pulled a trigger. She had pulled the lever on her own soul, trading a man's life for a strategic victory. She had become the monster so he could remain the man. He finally understood the war's final, cruel calculus. It hadn't just separated them. It had reforged them in opposite fires. It had made one of them a public hero and the other a necessary villain. She had taken the darkness, the moral compromise, the blood on her hands, so he could walk in the light of a free country. And in a strange, terrible way, that was the most perfect, devastating act of love he had ever witnessed. It was a love that demanded annihilation of the self. He knew she was still out there, a specter in the cold, grey world of espionage that was slowly hardening into a new, silent war. She was a shadow guarding a fragile peace, her fingerprints on 100 quiet operations he would never read about. He saw her in every headline about a captured Nazi in Argentina, in every rumor of a turned Soviet agent. And he realized with a clarity that finally stilled the tremor in his hand that he was her anchor. He was the fixed point, the only living soul on the planet who knew who Eleanor Vance truly was. Not the girl from the park bench, not the myth of Agent Sparrow, but the woman in between, the one who loved Vermeer and had killed for her country. He was the sole curator of her real memory, the keeper of the truth. And he loved her still. That was his deployment now. His silence was his service. His lonely, ordinary life in Maine was the rear-guard action in her endless war. The days bled into years with the slow, relentless rhythm of the tides. He learned the language of the gulls and the foghorn. His hair turned white, matching the winter caps on the waves. He was at peace, if peace is the acceptance of a beautiful, unhealed wound. He was standing his post. He was keeping the quiet for her. The years stacked up like sandbags against a flood that had already receded. The Korean War came and went, a distant, muddy echo in a newsreel. The world, desperate to forget, painted over its scars with bright colors and chrome. But Tom remained in his cabin, a sentry at a post everyone else had abandoned, a keeper of the flame for a war they were already calling the good one, as if any war could be. His life was a study in quiet. He woke with the gulls, developed photographs of lobster boats and storm clouds for the local paper, and went to bed with the sound of the Atlantic sighing against the rocks. It was the life he'd promised her, lived alone. His uniform was a worn flannel shirt, his foxhole a porch overlooking the endless grey water. The tremor in his hand, the one that came from the memory of mortars, had finally stilled, replaced by the steady patience of a man who had made peace with his ghosts. Then, on a rainy afternoon in the fall of '53, the past reached out and tapped him on the shoulder. The package was waiting at the post office, small and worn, soft at the corners from its long journey. It felt light in his hands, too light to contain what it did. No return address. The postage was Swiss. His heart, that old, tired muscle, began a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. Back in the cabin, with the rain ticking against the window pane, he unwrapped it with the reverence of a man defusing a bomb. The thin paper gave way, and there she was, a photograph. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, sat on a swing in a sun-dappled park somewhere in a world that wasn't Maine. She was caught in a moment of pure, unthinking joy, her head thrown back, her feet kicking at the air. She had a thick, unruly mane of dark hair and a smile, a crooked, defiant slash of light that was Eleanor's smile, stolen directly from that ruined French courtyard. But the eyes were his, the same deep, quiet gray, the color of the Atlantic under a winter sky. Eyes that had seen too much, even on a face so young. The photograph was crisp, professional. It held no other context, no clues beyond the face itself. It was a message, not a map. His hands, usually so steady now, began to shake. He turned the stiff cardboard over, and there it was. Her handwriting, Eleanor's elegant, unmistakable script, a relic from a life of old books and park benches, now used to deliver a truth that shattered the silence of his world. She likes the silence. 4 words. They hit him with the force of a howitzer shell. The air left his lungs. He sat down hard on the wooden stool by his developing table, the photograph gripped tight in his fist. He did the math. The numbers fell into place with a terrible, perfect clarity. 1948. She would have been born in 48, conceived in 47, during those 2 desperate, silent weeks in Europe after he'd left Santa Helene. After he'd read her confession, before he found her in the Florence Opera House. Before their final, wordless goodbye. The Opera House. He closed his eyes and he was there again. The soaring music, the dust motes dancing in the dim light. Her gaze meeting his across the dark void. The way she had touched her bare ring finger. He had thought it was a gesture of finality, a severing. He was wrong. It had been an acknowledgement. A silent transfer of a sacred, terrible secret. He hadn't just been a ghost to her. In that look, she had been telling him he was a father. He hadn't just come home with a new kind of silence. He had left a new kind of hope in her care. A living, breathing piece of them both, a child born into the shadows her mother inhabited. A girl who liked the silence because her mother was a knife and her father was a ghost, and silence was the only inheritance they could give her that was safe. He looked at the girl's face again, at his own eyes staring back from a past he never knew he had. The guilt over Davies, the weight of Eleanor's sacrifice, the long, lonely years of standing his post, it all suddenly shifted, rearranging itself into a new, profound duty. He wasn't just a keeper of a flame. He was a guardian of a living soul he would never meet. He unpinned a faded landscape from the wall above his developing trays and pinned the little girl in its place. She became his secret sunrise, his reason for every quiet morning that followed. He lived his life, not as a man left behind, but as a father serving from an impossible distance. His silence was no longer a burden. It was a shield. His love for Eleanor was no longer a memory. It was a living, breathing child in a park in Switzerland, a child who, against all odds, liked the quiet. He never contacted her. He knew the risk. The enemy she hunted did not forgive, and a child was a vulnerability. He would not give her enemies a target. His love for them had to be a fortress with no visible walls. He kept the photograph pinned to the wall above his developing trays, a small, square window into a parallel life. He looked at her face every day, his own personal secret sunrise. The girl's eyes, his own grey, quiet eyes, stared back from a past he never knew he had. He developed his own life around that one, small, unspoken truth, the chemical baths fixing the image of her smile into his soul, as permanently as the war had etched its lines on his face. He was a father, a fact known only to him, and a woman who was officially dead. It was the most classified operation of his life. He lived not in regret, but in quiet, profound service to that secret. He sent anonymous donations to children's charities in Geneva, the money a ghost moving through silent wires under the ocean. He read every news report about global politics. The Herald Tribune spread on his kitchen table, his finger tracing the datelines, Berlin, Vienna, Prague, watching for the signs of her continuing silent war. A defected scientist here, a captured spy master there. Each one a small victory for her, a silent toast for him. He was her distant sentry, standing a post she would never see. He understood now. Her final act of love wasn't leaving him. It was giving him a piece of her new life, a shared ghost to cherish. She had known he was drowning in the quiet of a normal life. She had thrown him a lifeline made of her own silence. She had known he needed a reason to live the life she told him to go back to. A reason to get up in the morning and face the mundane peace that felt, to him, like a different kind of battlefield. He had promised her a life free of shadows. Now he had a daughter living in the world of shadows, and he was the one who cast the longest shade, a protector whose greatest strength was his absence. But he was content. He was still a guardian, just from a distance of 4,000 miles and a lifetime of silence. His cabin in Maine became his observation post. The roar of the Atlantic was his static, the cry of gulls his only company. He took pictures of the sea in every mood, developing them in the red glow of his darkroom, the girl's photograph watching over the process. He was documenting the horizon, the endless space between them, because it was the only thing big enough to hold his love. The weight of the past, the guilt, the sacrifice, the lonely years suddenly crystallized into a singular purpose. He understood now that he was the guardian of a living soul, a duty that gave meaning to his quiet existence. He learned the geography of Switzerland from library books. He imagined her in a park in Bern, pushing a swing. He imagined her first day of school, her small hand holding her mother's. He furnished a whole life for her in the quiet theater of his mind, a life of small, normal joys he prayed were true. Sometimes, on the clearest nights, he would stand on the bluff behind his cabin and look east, across the dark, churning water. He'd feel the old tremor in his hand still. Not from fear anymore, but from the sheer impossible weight of it all. He had landed on Omaha Beach carrying a camera. He had fought through the hedgerows of Normandy. He had survived the war only to be shattered by a single photograph in a dark room. And now he was being reassembled by another. He was a man built from fragments, shards of shell casings, the scent of developer fluid, the sound of opera, and the silent, defiant smile of a little girl he would never hold. He was whole, but in the way a mosaic is whole, a beautiful picture made from 1,000 broken pieces held together by a promise he never knew he'd made. He was content because his love had finally found its true mission. It was no longer a desperate, clinging thing. It was a wide, deep, and patient force like the ocean below his home. It was a love that asked for nothing and gave everything. A love that existed in the space between a heartbeat and the memory of one, in the silence between the crash of waves. A father's love kept perfectly, at a perfect, impossible distance. He never came back completely. The man who walked onto that beach in '44 was a memory of a memory. He lived his life in a slow, permanent fade, a photograph overexposed by trauma, but focused by an unyielding, secret love. He learned that survival wasn't about bullets or bombs. It was about honoring the impossible choices made by the people you left behind. The greatest love stories, he learned, are sometimes the ones that are never finished, existing only in the silence between two hearts, separated by a world they risked everything to save. And even after the war ended, the only person who came home was her ghost. If you've ever loved someone who had to sacrifice everything for the greater good, then this story belongs to you. Tom Atherton died in his sleep in 1985, an old man with a full head of white hair and a reputation for being the quietest person in Maine. The local doctor called it a peaceful end. Tom would have called it a relief from the duty of remembering. He left behind a clean, sparse house, a neat stack of undeveloped negatives of lighthouses and gulls, and a single sealed envelope on the kitchen table, addressed to his lawyer in a town 20 miles down the coast. The lawyer, a young man who only knew Tom as the quiet fellow from the bluff, opened the envelope the next morning. The will was simple. It left everything, the cabin, the small savings, to a numbered foundation in Zurich. But it was the personal effects, itemized with a soldier's precision, that gave the lawyer pause. 3 things were to be placed in a specific wooden lockbox, the kind you could buy at any army surplus store: his tarnished dog tags, the bronze star he kept in a sock drawer, and a single, faded photograph of a little girl on a swing. The final instruction was written in a hand that was shaky but clear, the penmanship of a man determined to see one last mission through. The dog tags, the medal, and the photograph are to be placed in an empty wooden lockbox and mailed to a general delivery box in Bern, Switzerland. No return address, no note. He knew she would be the one to pick up the box, not the little girl, who would be a woman grown by then, but her mother, Eleanor. She would be the one to understand the language of these artifacts. The dog tags were the boy he had been. The medal was the hero he never felt he was. The photograph was the future she had given him, the reason he had endured the long, quiet years. It was the memory of his service, the symbol of his quiet love, and the image of the life they had created in a silent, perfect moment of chaos, all returned to her in a final act of trust. The war was finally over for him. They buried him on his own land, on the bluff overlooking the Atlantic as he had requested. No fanfare, no flag, just the town carpenter and the mailman who brought his groceries. The roar of the ocean was the only sound, a relentless crashing hymn that had been the soundtrack to his exile. The promise he broke to return before the leaves turned had been replaced by a different, enduring promise. The promise of a father's love, kept in the deepest shadow, a secret guarded more fiercely than any military secret. The silence that had followed him home from Europe, a noise so loud it had drowned out the parades, was finally complete. It was no longer an absence, but a presence, a finished thing. In a small post office in rural Maine, the clerk weighed the plain wooden box. It was surprisingly light for all it carried. He affixed the international postage and dropped it into a canvas sack. It began its journey across the ocean, back to the continent where its story had truly begun. Back to the woman who was a ghost in the official records, but who was, to one man, the most real thing he had ever known. He was a man rebuilt from fragments, shards of Omaha Beach, the chemical scent of his dark room, the weight of a camera in his hands, the sound of Puccini in a broken Italian theater, and the silent, defiant smile of a little girl he knew only from a photograph. The cracks of his trauma remained visible, but they had become part of his strength, the evidence of a life fully lived and deeply loved. His love had been his final deployment, a long Cold War of patience and protection waged across decades and continents. And in the end, he had held the line. He had kept the silence. He had saved the one thing that mattered. The truth of a love that asked for nothing and, in its quiet, impossible way, had given him everything.